will recall that there's been an Agribusiness constitutional landmark case, which quite frankly set a very important precedent on the public sector procurement regime and what it now means for purposes of organs of state and their authority to do that. We've then been requested to help the CIDB to sort of review the guidelines, issue new procurement, so that to enable the CIDB to issue new procurement guidelines that would be applicable to the public sector, infrastructure department, and the extent to which those should incorporate what we call empowerment and transformation-related imperatives. So this now that we're going to present is part of the consultation process with the participants to give them an opportunity to also input, critique, and give us feedback on what they think these proposed guidelines will be for purposes of their environment. Edward, maybe if we start with the first, I was just giving a preface. So you'll see that on the definition as interpretation, we try to go at length to define the relevant concepts and to what extent these are important for your area of environment, the Amended Construction Sector Code, BE as a legislative framework, and how these will impact on the area of your work. If you go to the next page, those are all the definitive concepts. We try at best to define all the concepts that will be used throughout the body and the content of the document. It may be possible that there are other relevant concepts and documents that we have not included here. Please feel free to bring this to our attention. You would know that the introduction and background is exactly that, to say public sector institutions, including those in construction, have both a moral and constitutional obligation to ensure that the transformation happens through the procurement of goods and through the procurement of services. So we therefore, in 2.1.1, suggest that through these guidelines, there would be an introduction of a purposeful, intentional introduction of increasing the participation of economically active groups in the population, because construction transformation, construction procurement must be used as a lever to facilitate such entrance. In 2.1.2, we discuss the construction sector empowerment framework as a whole, that it should also benefit the construction economy through supporting and building the capacity of enterprises that are owned by Black people. We do in 2.1.3 suggest that the construction sector entities must set aside some minimum targets for empowerment. We do bring this mindful of the fact that those who opposed the initial public procurement framework regulations that were issued, the 2017 version that was administered by the National Treasury, said that 30% requirement is unconstitutional. We do bring it back because the Constitutional Court directed that organs of state and in the environment sectors can set themselves priorities and targets based on development and empowerment objectives that they want to achieve in that area. So there's ipso facto nothing really untowards, as long as it's done properly through consultation, through engagement, and with the rationality. So the Constitutional Court was emphatic on saying organs of public institutions must not do things irrationally, unfairly, and without taking into account the cost effectiveness of those particular sectors. So we bring it back here, you would see. If we can go to the next page, we then discuss the 60%, 40% as a proposal for BE level contributions. So every BE level contribution construction measured entity must be in accordance with the Amended Construction Sector Code and not the generic BE codes, because there's usually that interrelatedness, but people used to generally confuse whether or not which codes are applicable in construction. Others would then accept affidavits and BE certificates issued in terms of the BE codes generic, others in terms of the Amended Construction Sector Code. I need to emphasize that when the Amended Construction Sector Code was gazetted, all that it meant is that going forward, there's no longer an option and choice for infrastructure-related businesses. They must use, and it doesn't say may, it says must use the Amended Construction Sector Code. So there's no choice or option available any longer. If in point 3, we deal with the scope of application, we do emphasize and recognize that the CIDB guidelines need to take into account that the CIDB's mandate is entrusted to ensure that the public sector infrastructure is developed and transformed. So their mandate is insofar as it relates to the public sector procurement, nothing in the private sector. That's why we do emphasize that the Public Finance Management Act, the Municipal Finance Management Act will have some relevance in the work that is imposed by these guidelines. We do discuss that where measured entities operate in more than one sector, they will have to look at whether, because there are those, Scott, you'll find that they do business in mining, they do business in other sectors, but they do have a presence in construction. So here we're saying in an event such overlap exists, the majority of the threshold for revenue has to be in construction for them to be covered or them to have these guidelines applicable to them. Okay. We also do discuss the guidelines and their status, that once they are approved by the CIDB, they will be incorporated to form part of your standard forms for uniformity, and then that will sort of ensure that they're becoming part of the guidelines going forward. Their intention and objectives, and we do mention that these guidelines is to introduce the applicability and the compliance methodology of the Amended Construction Sector Code. Non-compliance with such may attract consequences. And we say over and above giving effect to these provisions, we expect that under 5.3, that the categories of persons with disadvantage by unfair discrimination will be taken into account, in fact, elevated in the implementation of this. So under 6, we discussed the legislative and regulatory framework enabling the validity of these guidelines so that people understand that the CIDB did not sit in a corner there, thumbsuck this, decided to unilaterally impose this without taking into account. So we discussed the Constitution, that the Constitution is the mother of legislation, is the primary source of legislation enabling this, so that people don't come around and say, yeah, you just arbitrary, you just unfair, you just, you know. And we also discussed the fact that the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework, the BEE Act, and if you go down, and the Amended Construction Sector Code, and the PFMA and the MFMA all have got relevant provisions that enable and authorizes the CIDB to do what they're doing. Now, this is important, Richard, so that people, when people attack the CIDB to say, but where did you get the authority and the mandate to do that? People must understand that all these pieces of legislation, including, and in particular, the CIDB Act, do empower and authorize the CIDB to be able to do that. But hence the process of rationality, the process of lawfulness, the process of consultation, the process of openness, the process of cost-effective consideration must always be present in order to help you defend or justify these actions or these initiatives. Let's go now. I'm trying to 6.7. The procurement as a prescripts of the CIDB, yes, will be applicable, and these prescripts shall be aligned, and that we've discussed that. And the practical manual shall be used as a basic method of applying the sector code. You'd recall that there are already standards that are already existing. This does not seek to replace the standards, but these will form part of the standards so that they are able to give specific guidance to procurement. If we proceed, Edward, then you will see under 8, we're saying the incorporation of amended construction sector code and other transformation-related framework in the evaluation. We then say that in line with what the landmark decision in the Agribusiness Code said, the triple PF regulations of January 2023 that have actually been issued by the National Treasury are not necessarily mandatory, but they are a form of a guideline to enable. The genesis of the authority of institutions, organs of state is that they have the authority themselves in their area based on their peculiarities, based on their priorities, based on what are the issues there to develop these. And in doing that, they can do that in line with the existing legislation, not as a replacement of. So you do that in line so that you incorporate the provisions to the extent that they are relevant, that are applicable in your area of work, so that you are not found to have acted ultra vires or acted outside the mandate that create your institutions. 8.3.1, those are the issues. 8.3.2, we discussed the applicability of BE as an aspect of the Amended Construction Sector Code and what this actually means. If you go down, so what I should emphasize on is 8.3.4. 8.3.4 deals with the issue on the value of works. So we say here, depending on the value of work or contracts and subject to your procurement plan. So this is what is important. The Constitutional Court said, procurement must not be an event. Procurement must be a process. So in other words, you allocate budget to procurement, and that must be based on a procurement plan. In other words, you don't wake up this week and say, hey, tomorrow I want to procure this, next week I want this. This must be based on your annual plan and annual project plan, and that must take into account the availability of resources. And in planning so, you need to identify who makes up your database. How many in your database are there? How many Black women companies are there? How many youth? How many designated groups are there? So that over time, you are able to take into account interventions that are meant to capacitate those that may not necessarily be present in your sector, so that you don't come around tomorrow and say, yeah, but we can't procure from Black women-owned entities because we don't have them. But the procurement plan enable you to start processes to build the capacity of those so that you have them. In one financial year, you may not have them, but the other financial year, you could have cultivated them through subcontracting, through joint venturing, through special purpose vehicles, through a number of other interventions, enterprise development, through supplier development, so that you don't come around after 5 years and you are a procurement department of a certain infrastructure entity, but you continue to say you can't find those designated groups. Procurement plans here mean that you must deliberately put in place measures to build the capacity of those and ensure that they exist. Thank you, Edward. I think, yeah, number 9 deals with the mechanisms to monitor the use of compliance of the Amended Construction Sector Code by the and we put in place, because one of the biggest concern that the client, the CIDB, asked us is that how are we going to ensure that we monitor the compliance, because it's a critical thing. There is an issue of fronting in BE as a whole. People would know fronting is a BE misrepresentation. It's a misrepresentation of BE status. People do seek to get a better BE level without doing anything. It's simply put, is cheating. Cheating exists everywhere in every sector. You find it in tax, people do tax evasion. You find it at school, people at varsity, you know how many people want to graduate, but they don't want to put in the work of doing assignments and passing tests, so they go and forge certificates. Even at high school, people want to pass, but they don't want to study hard. So cheating you will find in every aspect and sector of society, because people just like quicker ways. So Richard will tell you that even in the register of contract, where they expect certain documents, financials, CICP documents, proof of experience, client referrals, you will be amazed at the number of efforts that people will do to make sure that they want that CIDP grading 6, 7, 8 without having proved their work. And that is very dangerous and is a serious indictment for the capacity of the infrastructure portfolio in the country, because once people successfully forge documents, they are then able to get awarded contracts where they actually do not even have the competence and the capacity to work. So this will help us ensure that BE level documents for all exempted enterprises, for all QSEs, based on their monetary value, produce the relevant proof of compliance. So far, affidavits are one of the things that the DTI had said must be used to show status of exempted micro enterprises, what you call. In construction, when I was still CEO of the Charter Council, we said affidavits are very risky. We may need to develop a sector-specific affidavit. Because an affidavit is exactly that. It's a sworn statement of fact where you can go to a pastor, you can go to a lawyer, you can go to a police station and just declare under oath, and they give you the certificate. And we know that in police stations, people don't do what is called quality assurance and fact verification. They just listen to what you tell them as a deponent, and they put a stamp, and an affidavit is complete. So if you are going to place reliance on such papers coming out of police stations when you determine procurement of millions and millions of rands, you definitely do run the risk of incompetence, because you may, as a result, allow people to be appointed when they shouldn't be appointed. So we say there has to be a specific form that will help develop. We've actually did do one when we were in the Charter Council that sort of zooms in the type of information that's relevant for purpose of what the client, the end user, needs to know about the capabilities of that entity. Okay. And then there is verification agencies that are overseen by their regulatory body, which is SANAS, South African National Accreditation System, that must ensure that they meet with the minimum requirements and competency tests that is to enable them issue BE certificates. Yeah. Is that the last page, Edward? Yeah, those are the conditions for eligibility. We list them there. We explain under what circumstances could be a bidder when they decide to go to a joint venture scorecard, a consolidated scorecard. All those things are provided for to help the end user be able to know, because there may be some nature of procurement that may not require single entities. They may require a combination of a consortium based on the variety of the portfolio of skills that are required for that project. In construction, it's very easy to find those 10 key projects sometimes require the mixture of general build, of civil contractors, of built environmental professionals, of architects, to all come under one roof to carry out a project. Now, to determine the BE status of each may be cumbersome. So we make provisions and allowance for joint and consolidated certificates to be used. And that is sort of SANAS accredited BE verification agencies are trained. We also did put in place guidelines at the Charter Council to help them determine how to soften the status of each in a consortium. All right. I'll then ask Papi or Karabo to make additions if there are any, but I think that's the genesis of the guidelines as we present them. This platform, this forum, is one of the key stakeholders identified as necessary in the process of developing these guidelines, failure of which would amount to a process not properly followed. We will then take you, Richard, on how then we want members of this platform would want to participate in engaging with this thing. Papi, do you have anything in addition maybe to add that I may have overlooked? Thank you.
That's from my side for now.
I know we are good for now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So yeah, Richard, this is a draft. These are the draft guidelines shown, and let's have an engagement, and then we can then welcome inputs and recommendation on how to make these guidelines work better, especially in the context of the intention as already outlined. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Masombo. Thank you, Tabo. And thank you, colleagues. I think, Sean, we're trying to highlight, and this is one of the most pertinent challenge that we always experience in the construction industry, where it's one of those thorns that come out in our national stakeholder forums. And when we have this forum is that, the general public and officials in government actually resort to the generic scorecard because it's simple to use in procurement. And also, if you look at how National Treasury even recognizes that, it then became a problem because we have sector codes which have to be complied with. And at the same time, we have this generic scorecard that everyone is looking at in procurement. So as an SCM official, it's easier for one to adapt to something that does not have issues, which meaning that you resort to the generic scorecard instead of advancing, the goals and objectives of the industry that is related to that. So that has been a serious thorn in the CIDB. And now in our space that we are playing in as far as construction procurement is concerned, then we needed to address this challenge. And through this, we needed to look at how can we guide public sector clients in using the sector code within the procurement space, and how going forward we'll even take the elements in the sector code and incorporate them as part of our evaluation processes. Be that may, we know that legislation is our landscape in procurement is changing. We have seen the bill as it was published by Parliament for comment, and we realize that there is a sudden shift from National Treasury from moving out of supply chain mode to a procurement mode, and we understand what does the meaning of procurement means, which is a process, that it manages, and what it's a management process, and it's different to what National Treasury understood what procurement is. And in the construction space, as we have seen in the bill, colleagues, as the CIDB, we are totally not aligned to what the bill is proposing in its current form. And hence we also have submitted drastic and heavy comments in that, so that we, as long as we are looking at our industry in construction, we need to make sure that the right things are incorporated in the bill. And you can see National Treasury, obviously, they are hiding a lot of things, saying that, they will resolve a lot of industry issues through regulation, which we know it won't happen. And yeah, that's how we are looking at this. And BEE, on its own, even if it's not enshrined in the 2022 regulations that were issued, it's still going to be there. It's still law, and we have to look at how then can we use that law, even though we know in our back of our heads that there is already a committee that is looking at the amendments of the BEE Act itself. But we had to look at what the industry can inform what BEE should look like in future, and whether has it helped the industry, or we have to be clear on our minds that since the inception of BEE, did it actually transform anything, or did it advance the status quo? So those are some of the things that we have to look at. Yeah. So colleagues, I think at this stage we can take questions from colleagues from
Richard.
the Masombuga team. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And so colleagues, please just raise your hand if you've got a question. I'd like to just kick off, if I may, Richard, just with a question to you and then a question to Thabo. So Richard, there have been a number of people that have joined since you first introduced. Maybe just summarize again the purpose of this. This is a draft. You're looking for input, and I imagine this is one of a number of different forums that you will be seeking input from. Is that correct? So that's a question
Yes,
for Richard.
yes, yeah, that's correct, Sean. Colleagues, my name is Richard Rapiri. I'm in the CIDB, heading the Procurement and Development Unit, which is basically the unit that looks at the prescripts as far as construction procurement is concerned, and also looking at how then we improve industry statuses and all that. So, and hence that I'm linking to what Parliament has already published as a procurement bill. Yeah, and then that's it. So here, colleagues, we are looking at this a draft practice note to guide public sector clients in as far as implementing the sector code in the construction industry. So we know that most of our public sector are using the generic scorecard with the previous regulations, of course, in terms of your levels and as far as your preferential procurement goals are concerned. So with the shift by National Treasury in the 22 regulations, we have seen that there is no BEE incorporated in those regulations, and therefore it will create another gap in terms of how then does one implement your preferential points. And if that is the case, and we know what the bill is now proposing and what will be the future in terms of regulations, meaning that the BEE will see itself back into our procurement processes. So hence we are now preempting what will come, and we are asking for input into this process so that we can guide the industry going forward. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Richard. So that was my next question, is to be very clear in this. And you don't have to respond to this. This is just initial feedback from my side. Very clear on who the target is for this guideline. And Taba did mention that this is the amended sector code for the construction industry. And he mentioned a percentage of the procurement spend that an organization needs to be spending on construction that would require them to then use this as their scorecard to measure themselves. And so that, I think, would need to be very clear. Upfront is who is this guideline targeting? Because there are hundreds of organizations that do procurement spend in construction, but there are very few of them that this might apply to. I'm being controversial now. It's the Sunrails of the world. It's the public works of the world, where the bulk of their procurement spend is in construction. So that's one. I wanted to just ask you if you wouldn't mind going back to the definitions right up front. Your definition of I think it was just go down. I just want to, thank you.
I think you may be in relation to that one, 1.1.7, the definition of a construction sector entity.
Yes.
Is that the one you're showing?
Yes, yeah. yes.
Because maybe let me just come in there.
Sure, Taba.
Sean. So, and I will read this together with and you are right. Let me just quickly, I see that when I started speaking, there were about 25 participants. And when I check now, it's something like 57 participants. Correct. So maybe just for purposes of the introduction, maybe let me do that myself again. My name is Thabo Masombuga. I'm an executive transformation consultant. For a purpose of this engagement, I'm with Nyaputse Incorporated, who were asked by the CIDB to help develop the guidelines, construction-related guidelines, insofar as procurement transformation is concerned, taking into account the developments in the procurement regime throughout the country over the past few years, including but not limited to the impact of the Constitutional Court case involving the AfriForum business, the AfriBusiness and the Minister of Finance, that led to the introduction of the 2022 version of the 2022 version of the preferential procurement regulations, and subsequently the Gazette for public comments of the public procurement bill.
Yeah.
So I thought it's important that I put that context.
Thank you.
You can have a sense of what we're talking about.
Sure.
So 1.17, in there, we're trying to, in no unambiguous terms, trying to zoom in the definition of what is a construction-related entity for construction sector entity for purpose of these guidelines, so that we determine who the end user is in line with the scope of application. And we do say there, it means all the civil contractors, general built environmental professionals, including the material suppliers and infrastructure entities. Then the last part refers to your clients. You are right. There are a number of private sector entities that have got buildings and that develop malls and develop properties all over the case, right? In fact, they invest in portfolios.
Yeah.
They invest in private equity funds.
So Thabo, who is this guideline aimed at?
This guideline is aimed at your public sector client and bodies, which are your departments that are intended to roll out public sector procurement, at least for the purpose.
And this guideline is targeting all of them, or is it targeting those where the bulk of their procurement spend is in construction?
Where the bulk of their procurement spend is in construction. That's why somewhere there, that's why somewhere down there, I can't remember what paragraph is it, Edward. I think immediately after the scope of your application, we're trying to discuss that there will be instances where some construction clients and some construction firms and businesses may have their presence in more than one sector, including the mining sector, including any other aspect. But where the bulk of a majority of your threshold of revenue, majority of the threshold of your budget, procurement budget is in construction, then this would be applicable to you.
Now, is that percentage here in the guideline?
We didn't. We just made reference to a majority of your revenue, a majority
just
of
as
procurement.
Because this is a big issue, right?
Yeah.
This is a big issue because the public sector out there has been told that not the generic scorecard. They need to apply the public sector scorecard, not the generic scorecard. And there's some out there that are in other sectors that also do construction procurements by, let's take DBSA. DBSA is Development Bank of South Africa. They have to comply with the Financial Sector Code. So that target must be very clear here to help the public sector understand who is this guideline aimed at.
Thanks, Sean. You are correct, and yes, we would like that input. That's a good observation from your side there, and we're also looking at what is coming out in general. If you look at what is coming out in the bill, the procurement bill from Parliament, there's some of the powers that Public Works has, and there's already discussion currently now to actually even, I don't know what is the perfect word, but to get rid of Public Works, if I can put it that way. And now infrastructure budgets are now lumped into the different departments, which now they must manage their own construction portfolios. So we are already looking at what the future will be like, and make sure that those entities. Look at the Department of Health managing a construction portfolio. One will ask whether there is capacity or not, And we know that these decisions are based on the failure of mostly public works to service, the different departments. And now we are seeing a total shift in terms of what government is looking at currently. And we have to be ready for that so that we don't have total collapse of our infrastructure.
Because this is a very complex space. I mean, when you look at local government and municipalities, very complex. Andres Lowe has raised his hand. And Andres is coming to us all the way from the Eastern Cape, and is very well respected in the public procurement space. Andres, you're welcome to unmute. I think you can unmute. Raise a question. Welcome, please.
Good morning. Yes, I joined a bit late, sorry, and I might even drop off again just now for a few minutes. But I just wanted to comment. My interpretation, and again, I accept the fact that I joined late, maybe missed some of the briefing, but my understanding of the role of the CIDB, the minute the CIDB is involved, it seeks to control its registered members, if I can use that term. That's all the graded parties that's part of the CIDB. So CIDB, for all intents and purposes, are controlling all of those contractors in that particular space. As far as it goes for government procurement entities, obviously we have the triple PFA that guides us. But one of the elements is that when we do construction, with the exception of human settlements, who makes use of the NHBRC, we have to subscribe to the CIDB regulations. And that regulations then basically compels us to use the relevant gradings as per the CIDB. So all the control actually happens between the CIDB and the graded contractors and consultants that works for them. That's my understanding. So if a guideline that seeks to push a certain let's call it development agenda here, I think it almost relates to the contractor and his procurement spend, because we already remember when the triple PFA regulations were challenged, the big argument behind that was that there was a double BE bite, in the sense that you already have the preference points given based on the 80-20 and 90-10 rule, and now you put additional requirements on top of that, and that was regarded as like I said, a double bite for that sectors. So the reality is as the government procurement entities, I don't think it implies that we need to subscribe to an additional requirement when it comes to interacting with the CIDB's members. This, I believe, is more focused on the member, the members of the CIDB. Gray area here is, and I tend to believe there is let's, for lack of a better word again, there's an uncontrolled entity in the equation, and that is what we refer to as implementing agents. By the way, they know where. Is there any legislation that attempts to explain the role and responsibilities of implementing agents? And from a Tracy perspective, we just see it as a cost, unnecessary cost that administrators doing other administrators' work. And the reality is the right sequence of events is supposed to be the client and the engineer, and no third party in between. But it's something that creeped in over the last last decade, basically already, and it's really become a bit of a scourge, because it really reduces the impact of our budgets because of all the additional layers of cost. So that's a different topic, but thank you. That's sort of my statement.
So the amended sector code for the construction industry is the B scorecard that an entity will use to measure themselves so that they can determine whether they're a triple B level 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Okay.
Correct.
That's what the scorecard is used for, is for that entity to determine what their level is. Now, Andres, the construction industry sector scorecard, the primary focus there is all those big construction companies out there, and small construction companies out there, and there are many out there. In your province, let's take your province, Andres. Which of the entities have the majority of their procurement spend in construction? Question one. Question two, which of those entities are actually even developing their own scorecard, measuring their own scorecard, and coming up with a score? Question for Andres.
I can help answer that as well.
Yeah, for it. Yeah.
So you're correct. The Amended Construction Sector Code is your version of the financial sector code for the banks.
Correct.
The version of your mining sector code for the mining industry.
Yeah.
Is your version of a tourism sector code for all
Yeah.
the tourism
Yeah.
suppliers, right?
Yeah.
But there is an implied and there's an imposition. So this imposition is made by what is called the BE Amendment Act of 2014. So a BE Amendment Act imposes compliance of not only the measured entities that must have a B level certificate, but it extends that responsibility to the public sector bodies.
That we
So these are your
understand.
departments.
Yeah.
Those are your departments. Those are your organs. Those are your entities, including your agencies, which are the so-called implementing agencies. So in construction, you will have your IDTs, Independent Development Trust.
Sure.
You have all those. So all those, to the extent that they are public sector, their responsibility to report through a mandated scorecard. So theirs is a mandated scorecard because, for instance, it doesn't have certain measurement elements, which you would find in the scorecard.
Like ownership.
Like ownership, like management to a certain extent. So they will have what is called a mandated scorecard or specialized scorecard. So the responsibility also extends. Now, back to your earlier question, who is this intended to? So this would be intended to, one, for all the Greneca, Avengers, WPHOs, all those who supply services for construction. That's the one. But it also goes further too, and these are the ones that are registered, and this is what refers to them as those that are registered in the register of contract in the CIDB contractor register. But the CIDB also has another responsibility, remember, to manage the list of contracts. So these that are issued by the public, your Department of Health, your access, your Department of Transport, because the responsibility. So maybe, Richard, I think now that I see where this is going, and it may be not clear in this document, what we need to go and emphasize here is the paragraph that relates to the scope of application. And the applicability of these guidelines. There we have to define in no uncertain terms, in no unambiguous terms, who this is applicable to. It will talk to the measured entities that are actually being scored in terms of BE. It will talk to infrastructure departments whose main and primary or majority of the budget is in construction. We may need to define what majority means for this purpose so that you remove all the unambiguity and uncertainty that may exist. We may need to define the role of implementing agents, because in law, implementing agents cannot have the powers and the use of fact the role of their principals, because in every agency relationship in law, there must be a principal mandate giver of that agent. Agents are implementing on behalf of. They are not implementing on their own. They're usually implementing on behalf of. And once we define those that agents are implementing on behalf of, we're then able to cover NWASH code. Then we talk to local government and say to extend it has the portfolio of what you call. I think the definitions of the scope of application may need to be expanded here. Thank you. Thank you.
Good.
Correct.
Sorry, go ahead, Richard, and then we'll go to Blake.
I think Blake has been on the call for a long. Let's take Blake, and then I'll come in.
Thank you. Go ahead, Blake.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Sean and Richard. My question just relates from personal experience, having been in a public sector entity that had to be scored and rated in terms of the BBBE Act. When dealing with a rating agent, and they're obviously assessing your procurement spend, and you need to now submit the BE certificates and the scorecards and so forth of the entities who you've paid. And this relates to the question that Sean was raising, is to say, where is the majority revenue coming from relating to that bidder that you are obviously assessing? And if this guideline is to say that no, in construction procurement, this is how you have to assess the construction sector scorecard, and there's specific thresholds for EMEs and QSEs that are going to come into play. What I have had, and I would like to maybe see that in this guidance, is to say that what happens in a situation, as we know, companies diversify, they operate in various sectors. What is the procuring entity, myself, the public sector, supposed to do when assessing preference in terms of this guideline, where a company can prove that majority of their revenue is not within the construction sector, falls within a different sector, and they are thereby governed by that sector code in terms of assessing their BBBE scorecard? I'm raising it here because that has been a contentious issue in the past for me for a number of years, where I've needed to go back to a contractor because they tender in a specific category, in a specific sector. That information and the evidence is then submitted to the rating agent who is assessing my organization. However, that rating agent then comes back and says, no, this revenue only represents 20% of that company's total budget, and they actually get majority, which is 40% from the finance sector, so they must please submit the finance sector scorecard. And that's just, especially when if you're going to need to push on to this, is to say, what leverage will we as the public sector procuring entity have to tell, number one, our rating agency why, and the secondly, obviously, the contractor to say, this is why we are saying you must submit a construction sector scorecard in order to get your 20 or your 10 points. Sorry, that's just the question from my side. Thank you.
Great one. And I think partly trying to answer that on the fronting section of this document. And let's ask Khali to come and ask her question, then we'll go back to Richard, Thabo, and the team. Hello, Khali.
Thank you, Sean. I actually just want to follow up as well on what Blake does. And from my perspective, asking it for an entity that is in a group format. Taking, for example, the GGDA, we had a number of subsidiaries in different sectors, from the auto, from precious metals, and also we are an implementing agency for the Gauteng province in terms of infrastructure, especially for investment purposes. And I'm just trying to figure that out. I think mostly, I think it's Richard has said that they're gonna go back and actually provide more clarity in terms of how we deal with that. Because I was just trying to think, well, now for me, because as the GGD holdings, taking myself outside the group, my bulk of my procurement is in infrastructure. But then what happens then if I do a consolidated BEE in terms of different sectors, how now that play out? And also the second issue, for example, that also Blake touched on, to say if an entity is rated or assessed in terms of a group, and then we have to say what portion of that entity actually makes up the infrastructure. And in terms of their code, because we're saying now, based in terms of the guideline, the entity have to strictly submit the BEE that is infrastructure or construction related. But they are bidding as a group of entity, and they might have in terms of maybe 60% of their revenue coming from banking, as an example, but they have a 40% in terms of that is infrastructure, and they got a portfolio that proves they can be able to deliver in terms of infrastructure. And in terms of how now we're gonna deal with those dynamics, and for me, it affects me as an entity, as a government agency, and also for the contractors that are actually now bidding for the work. So I think we need to be those guidelines must come very, very clear, so that we don't have issues also when you need to be assessed, or also when you need to be assessing them to award the work. So I think that needs to be looked at.
Thank you. I mean, you're just raising the complexity and the importance of that target applicability aspect. So Richard and Thabo, Khali is with the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency. Within that agency are a number of different entities, from the automotive supplier park in Roslyn to the Cradle and many others. So very, very diverse in that respect, and some aspects of that are construction related. So yeah, just to help you understand the complexity of this issue of the target. Go ahead, Richard and Thabo.
Yeah, no, I welcome the contribution from Andres, Blake, and Khali. Very good observations there. But I'm also looking at the problem that we have as government. And it's a wide, this problem is becoming wide and wide. Because as we are struggling as government, and we are looking at people who don't want to do what they're supposed to do in terms of their mandate, we introduce in the space an agency that will then facilitate that process. It has been a trajectory in our government, unfortunately, that even in public works it happened. I mean, if you look at the setting up of IDT and all that, you look at the school program that supposedly Department of Education should handle, and it was in the hands of Public Works. And Public Works now are failing, and then they introduce IDT to do that project management part, and IDT is failing, and then we introduce MISA to,
Well, we are where we are, and you know the direction it's moving in.
You're anticipating that. And now the proposed bill is now getting rid of Public Works and now creating another problem in the space. So yeah, no, I welcome this, and yes, we will be able to go back to the drawing board and clear out some of these ambiguities which will come out of this. Yeah, we will go back and look at that. But at the end of the day, we also look at what the future is like for the CIDB. And as the CIDB, as colleagues would know, that the CIDB regulations were mostly linked into the public sector space. So the CIDB was mostly regulating what happens within the public sector space and not what happens within the private sector space. Now, question would be, has the CIDB, in terms of the current act, have a role in extending it to the public sector, to the private sector? The question would be no. And then why do we leave the private sector? Now, we are managing a national database of contractors in South Africa, meaning that a contractor in South Africa cannot take over a site without registering with CIDB in the public sector space. That on its own is wrong if one looks at it, because Even if you are a qualified engineer, you cannot certify any work if you are not registered with the different councils that we have through the CBE. Now, so we need to look at how do we redress these anomalies and look at what the OSH Act has already incorporated in the industry. It's easy because the OSH Act applies both to private and public.
Yeah.
Why can't CIDB then regulate the whole space? And that brings into the element that we, as the CIDB, we have realized all this, and we have spoken to our mother entity, which is Public Works, to look at how we can then amend our CIDB Act. And if you look at now, because of this shift of government and National Treasury bulldozing everybody, you will see different entities are actually amending their acts currently. I know for a fact that as the CIDB, we are in the process of amending our act. The CBE itself is in the process of amending its act, and HBRC is doing the same.
Absolutely.
And all of us, we are playing a role in the construction industry. So we need to have some kind of synergies in terms of how then going forward are we shaping this industry, because we are all playing a part. In a CIDB cannot be a regulator for the construction industry, but we also have other regulatory bodies who are then having a different mandate outside the CIDB. So this is all
good.
Things that we are realizing, and we are talking about it, and we are talking to the different entities in terms of how do we get this thing right, and we're taking the likes of the UK in terms of how they did it right. And if you look at most of our even our regulations, we borrowed them from the UK, from Singapore, from different countries to look at how can we get this thing right. And
Richard?
I think I will stop there, Sean.
Thank you. I've also got something else I'd like, a couple of other questions to raise as well, just to try and help you guys with this important job that you're doing. I think Taba wanted to say something.
Thank you, Sean. I am going to just briefly say that it's true that we'll have to define in specific form and in now uncertain terms who the end user is for purpose of this guideline. We're going to have to define and tighten the scope of application. We're going to define the definition of what a majority threshold or budget is for purpose of these guidelines. We're going to have to define for purpose of BE in construction, which is the Amended Construction Sector Code, the end user, the front end and the back end. We're going to try to define, because there's also an element of triple Ps. Triple Ps are your private-public partnerships, right? Now you know where I'm going with this. That we have not really, and which are a reality. They are a realistic phenomenon in our construction infrastructure instances. But Richard is correct. A lot of the complexities in the construction rollout in our country are usually self-created. Therefore, these guidelines are not going to be an alpha and omega, meaning they are not going to provide the entirety of the solutions. They will contribute to the extent that they relate to the mandate of the CIDB insofar as public sector contracts and infrastructure projects are concerned. Someone else somewhere there must still do their part and must align their efforts in line with what is generally intended. But I think based on this session and based on a number of interactions, there may be a need to improve some aspects that still create some levels of uncertainty here. Thank you very much.
I'd like to raise another perspective to help you possibly extend the scope of applicability of this. And I'm just going to share something, and then I'm going to ask Edward to reshare again. So I'm just going to share something on this side, Edward, and then So what I'm showing here is an extract from the Act itself, the BBBE Act. And the BBBE Act 10(1)(b) is where everyone is focused at the moment. With the Preferential Procurement Regulations 2022 effective from 16th January this year. And 10(1) says every organ of state and public entity must apply any relevant code of good practice issued in terms of this Act in B, developing and implementing a preferential procurement policy. And I think if the guide can help entities understand this, it would also help, particularly in the construction space. Every organ of state and public entity must apply any relevant code of good practice in developing and implementing a preferential procurement policy. Now, preferential procurement policy is also mentioned exactly in those three words in 2(1) of the PPPFA, where it says that an organ of state must determine its preferential procurement policy and implement it within the following framework, and it goes from 2010. So it must be talking about the same thing, the same preferential procurement policy. So in the construction industry, how do you interpret this statement in the Act? How does somebody in a public entity interpret this statement? What is the relevant code of good practice? I don't know, Tava, do you have any thoughts?
No, the relevant code of good practice is exactly that. All that I've mentioned earlier, you remember? The various sectors. So the relevant code in construction would be the Amended Construction Sector Code. The relevant code in mining would be your mining charter. The relevant code in financial services will be your Financial Sector Code. The relevant code in ICT will be all those codes that have been gazetted in terms of this Act, Section 9(1) in particular.
So now when developing a preferential procurement policy, which is the relevant code of good practice?
That would be the Amended Construction Sector Code. Taking into account means when you develop this preferential procurement policy, to the extent that you set out requirements for targeted procurement beneficiaries, you must take into account the provisions of those. And to the extent that we did here, I think there's a page Edward will show where we're discussing based on some different level of thresholds of amounts. We propose that only BE contribution in terms of the amended sector code with B level 1 to 2, 3 to 4 need to be taken into account. Those are the proposals that we, for instance, have brought forward in line with what the provisions of Section 10 says.
So let me take an example. I'm just for the purpose of this illustration, I'm Sunrail. So the bulk of my work is construction. And so let's assume that I as Sunrail, apply the Amended Construction Sector Code. But I want to now buy something in marketing and communication, or IT. Must I, as Sunrail, now in my preferential procurement policy start to concern myself with the ICT sector's code when I'm buying an ICT service, or marketing and communication sector code if I'm buying public relations services?
Yeah.
What is the relevant code of good practice?
Yeah, because now when you with Sunrail, your major bulk of infrastructure or major bulk of procurement spend is obviously in construction, right? So you take into account the Amended Construction Sector Code, but where you have to buy in other things that are ancillary to your business and that are not in your core business, you obviously have to apply or source suppliers in marketing, in ICT, including the banks, because for instance, if Sandra, we have the money, your money is in a bank.
Absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, it's in a bank, and to decide which bank you want to use, if you want to take into account preferential consideration, you would then say that the issue.
So you understand where I'm going, Thabo? I'm not sure if it's on my side that we lost, but I think we might have lost Thabo. I don't know. Richard, are you still there?
Yeah, Sean, I hear you, and the same argument can be brought again, even if you look at what we have defined in our act as what is construction industry. Because now we're saying construction industry is a conglomeration of sectors and industries. Now, the minute you say conglomeration of sectors and industries that contribute towards the development or refurbishment, dismantling of a fixed asset. Now, at the end of the day, it becomes a fixed asset. Now, one looks at now, as you are developing this conglomeration of sectors and industries, it brings in everyone, because it brings in your engineers, it brings in your constructors, it brings in your material suppliers, manufacturers of those material, and also it involves your IT, electricity, everything is there. So the same argument can be brought into that, but we now zoom into how does it relate to the construction activity. So even if, let's say, a person goes for a design and build concept, because that will fit exactly within the conglomeration of industries and sectors. So I believe that, you know, your supply chain policy in relation to this section 10 that you have brought into the picture here should be flexible enough to allow the code that is relevant to what is being procured at that point.
And I think this is coming to Blake's point, is the guideline and the applicability of the guideline should also pick on this aspect. That we've got a Department of Health in Northwest.
Yes.
And they are going to now buy a construction service for a new clinic or whatever, a wing in an existing hospital or something that's construction related. How does that entity that is not being measured by the Amended Construction Sector Code, how do they apply the Construction Sector Code when sourcing a construction service? You're asking for example that the supplier must give them a construction sector scorecard.
Correct. And obviously in their guidelines, it must be clear for even their invitation, so that people who respond to that advert or that invitation must know that they are expected to forward this suitable piece of evidence. Someone spoke earlier about the determination of the threshold. The threshold, I can't remember who it was, but there was an issue about the suitability of evidence to determine. Right?
Yes.
That
was Blake.
Blake, yes. Yes, sorry, Blake. I remember. When I was CEO of the Construction Charter Council, we were seized with that a lot, because people said, yeah, but hold on. If you're saying 51% majority of my threshold of my revenue from the construction sector, how do I determine or sort of set out how to arrive at that particular what you call? So we then arrived at the conclusion that there's some suitable evidence, such as, and not limited to, but that's the only most relevant and acceptable evidence, that the contractor or the business has to provide us proof of a letter of good standing coming from your auditors, Because your auditors and your accountants, financial accountants are the one who determines your financial books, and they are able to determine which part of your revenue comes from which sector. And we then agreed as the council at the time that that could be what is called an acceptable source or an acceptable, suitable piece of evidence to determine. But then again, it goes back to the issue of whether or not people intend to cheat the system or whether they want to genuinely demonstrate that my revenue comes from this particular sector.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Can you, Edward, if you wouldn't mind just sharing the document again, I just wanted to suggest going to the subcontracting point. And whilst up to subcontracting, and just to say, Thabo, one of the big challenges in the public sector at the moment is trying to understand the move in mindset from a condition of tender to a condition of contract. Edward, if you wouldn't mind going up to the subcontracting aspect, which is around 3 or 4 or 5, somewhere around there. Section further up.
Do you remember which under which section?
I think it was about 4 or 5. Where you said okay, so status, intention objectives, you made it very clear, Thabo, as you're going through, that subcontracting is going to remain an important requirement. And you mentioned the 30% was there. If you just do a search on there it is.
Yeah, there we go. 2.1.2 going down, yes.
Okay, maybe it isn't subcontracting. Maybe I heard subcontracting. It's not. That doesn't look like it's what's it. Okay, no, that okay. It's not relevant. What I was just going to say is that there's the PPR 2017 brought in subcontracting as a condition of tender, and that is one of the things that the High Court said, or the Supreme Court of Appeal said was not part of the framework, the policy framework, and so one of the areas that I thought you might be getting into is...
No, you're right, John. It shouldn't be part of the framework.
Okay.
Yeah, and
but it can be a condition of contract, Richard.
Yes, it can, and this is what the National Treasury missed.
Yes.
When we published, because we published the CPG, which is a construction participation goal, and we mentioned that in that CPG standard, that there could be a minimum of a certain percentage, which in our original CPG, our minimum was saying, a client might decide between 10 to 40% of subcontracting arrangements as part of the condition of a contract, based on certain elements and certain conditions that the client would have observed where the project is based. But Treasury then took that and made a condition as part of a regulation which it should have not been, and we highlighted that, and that is why after they published that, we had to retract our standard, so that we there is no confusion between ourselves and National Treasury, even though we knew that what they have put in the PP regs it's unwarranted. But in any case, those regulations are gone now, and we are now rehashing our own CPG, which we will be republishing probably before this financial year end goes. So that's what we are now looking at.
Yeah, if there's anything you can include in this guideline that would help a public entity understand how to incorporate subcontracting as a condition of contract,
Yeah.
that would be helpful to public entities.
Yeah.
Thabo, I just wanted to ask you, and this document, and Richard as well, please, one of the big things that the Concord judgment gave us in the business case is the focus on 2172. And just as a principle, I think it's so important that whenever we mention 217, we can't just mention the principles that are in 2171 and not include a statement about 2172. You mentioned 2173 is up there as the framework. Here's your 217 statement for the Constitution. Fair, equitable, transparent, competent, and cost effective. But I didn't see 2172.
Yeah.
It's got to be here. Thabo, are we on the same page?
Yeah.
Right. If I can just chip in there. The 2172 is the enabling section for the BE Act, and 2173 is the enabling section for the triple PFA. So each one of them does create an act for its purpose. So the reference to the triple BE Act is sufficient to actually be almost like the equivalent of referencing 217.
Yeah, and thanks, Andres, you're right. But in addition, what the code even said, which goes back to what we're doing here, and that's why we're not somewhere in agriculture, we're not talking something in health, we're here because sector-specific organs must then look at their priorities and developmental goals. So he spoke about transformative and developmental priorities. So I think I hear you. We will then, in this paragraph, Karabo, just make the note, please. In this regard, section 217, then we'll make specific reference to 2171, 2 and 3, and make those things clearly articulated. I think it's important. All right.
If we can jump to your right at the back end, after I think 10, where you've got the references to the JVs and the consortiums.
Okay. I think that's where we talk about the suitability of conditions of eligibility. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. You've got reference to, is this the section where you refer to the consolidated scorecard? For a consortium or JV, might be towards the back end of this. Whilst you're going for it, I just wanted to say that this is they were in the event of a joint venture specific project consolidated valid triple B in the name JV issued for a verification by Senator shall be submitted. This is a big issue with many public entities at that point. And the Triple B Act makes a distinction between a incorporated joint venture and an unincorporated joint venture. And I think it would be nice for the guideline to make that distinction, explain what that means, and what the implications of that are. Am I making sense? So the Triple B, so the Amendment Act, Triple B Amendment Act says that there is a unincorporated joint venture and an incorporated joint venture.
Yes, and both of them attract separate and different legal consequences. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and as far as the Triple B certificate is concerned, they both require a consolidated Triple B certificate as if it was one.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you've got an unincorporated joint venture, so you've got two entities that haven't created a company, they're two entities, but they submit one tender because that's what the particular construction project calls for. It requires somebody with air conditioning and somebody with construction, and two different. They haven't created a company, but they've submitted as one. Then the Act says they must still submit as if they were one, which requires now two EMEs to go and pay a sinus verification agent to give them a certificate as if they were one. And the help around that, the guideline around that for public entities would be useful. Andres, I see you've raised your hand. Did you want to say something else? I'm not sure if I'm making sense, Tabo.
Yes. I get you.
Okay.
I get you. So you're suggesting that we break down the different forms of JVs, right?
Yes.
And discuss the extent of the expectations or the requirement for purpose of submission of a B certificate.
Yes.
No, that's fine.
Yes.
There are some specific provisions that we made in the Construction Sector Code that deals with this. And based on the B Act provisions, we'll take that into account. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And but why this is important is there was a cost implication with 2017's regulations. Because the Jacqueline, I see your hand. We'll come to you shortly. Because the scorecard was being used as the basis for the points allocation for preference points or specific gold points. All the entities that submitted had to go to a status verification agent to get a consolidated scorecard if they were going to get points. That's no longer a requirement for the submission of a tender as an unincorporated joint venture. Because if the scorecard is not going to be used for points, then they only have to get that scorecard if they're awarded the deal. They only have to go to the status verification agency if they've been awarded the deal as a I don't know if I'm making sense here. Let's go to Jacqueline.
Hi, Sean. Just wanted to find out, going back to this, the unincorporated JV, as you've mentioned earlier on, it's not now have a legal name that is registered. So now what is it should be now both entities on the unincorporated consolidated B certificate, the names of both? Does it need to indicate now who is the lead? How do you go around that? And when it comes to the EMEs, I know with when it comes to the BA certificate, they still can submit the affidavit. So how do you?
That's the implication of the Act, and so thank you for raising this, and I hope this is helping Tabo and the team understand how important this is from a guideline perspective on this issue. Maybe they can come in and answer that question. I can give my view.
Thank you, Jacqueline. The requirement for a BEE affidavit for EMEs is sacrosanct in the BE legislative framework. What that means is that it cannot be replaced because of what Sean has said earlier. The purpose was to eliminate the cost associated with BE verification by small emerging exempted enterprises. So if they are part of a JV, incorporated or unincorporated, they have to demonstrate their BE status through a form of an affidavit. Okay, that has to happen. But however, if, and this is what we'll need to work out after discussion with Richard and them, if we have unincorporated JVs for purpose of these guidelines, those can only be expected to produce a consolidated BE certificate post-award, right? Only after they have been awarded the contract, not before. And then we need to look at what is an acceptable form of evidence for purpose of those JV arrangements in this guideline. And that's what Sean was suggesting, that break it down, separate between your incorporated and unincorporated and what each means for purpose of these guidelines. And that's what we're basically going to work back and try to improve in this document, because there has to be clarity on how they relate, because especially it's easier where a JV, there are just two parties, but in other instances, there'll be more than two parties. There'll be 3, 4 parties, right? And each JV must outline who the lead partner is, and what is the percentage of that value of their contract, and what is the percentage of their obligations. Because a JV, from you as an end user point of view, you need to be clear, where do we apportion responsibility to? So that someone must outline that they're the lead partner, to what extent, what is a significant part of their lead role, who is the supporting party, and what is the extent, who is the because others may be part of that for purpose of skills transfer only, that they are brought there for purpose of skills transfer. But you as an end user and the client must understand that outright from the agreement, so that should anything go wrong somewhere down the line in the project, you can be able to apportion responsibility and blame as required by whatever form of contract that you would be using. Thank you. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, you've done that. I think again, I think the challenge it comes when because now obviously we're now applying the 2022 PPR, and each and every organs now, they have to now come up with their own specific goals, and I think becomes a little bit tricky when it comes to the unincorporated JV, as in which B certificate take preference. Are you going to use the lead, or do you consider both? I think that's just where my question comes from. I think that's where it's unclear when it comes to these evaluations, because you need now to allocate points accordingly to what you are evaluating on. So I think that's where the challenge comes in.
Richard, do you want to come in there, and I can maybe just help Jacqueline as well?
Yeah, I think there might be serious uniformity application around this, and we should actually provide clarity around how this. But the first point of call would be the starting point in terms of how CIDB regulations are crafted, in terms of, the lead partner must show, and the regulations are guiding that the lead partner must have the required grade, or the required specified grade, and the required specified class of works that is warranted. And also they will have to take them through the JV calculator to check whether that combination of partners is actually meeting the requirements of what has been advertised. And that's your point of call. And then your second point of call is now the allocation in terms of how do you distribute, because now you know who's the lead partner, and then the lead partner, obviously based on these liabilities, you will then look at what will then be how you can allocate points, or also do risk assessment if there is any processes, because in most cases you'll find that the person who actually is the highest and has got the required skill and meets the minimum requirements is a person that carries almost the lowest liabilities on the contract, and that is an abnormality that a person at the end point must look at those risk elements. Yeah, thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to ask Andres to come in, and whilst he's getting ready, just to ask Richard and the team if there are any specific questions you'd like to have some input on the draft. Go ahead, Andres.
Okay, I think Jacqueline brought up a point that is actually critical to this whole discussion, and that is the specific goals that's currently mentioned by the PPR. And I want to, if you don't mind, can I quickly just share with you? I want to show you something, how this thing actually hits the market. What happened is they revised the SBD 6 form, and I hope I'm doing this right. Okay, and they replaced it now with a new SBD 6 form that, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
And what's very interesting about this, and it's almost like it sneaked in on the side, because we're all like, I just want to get to a place where I can navigate this document, because now I'm sort of lost. I'm not used to Zoom, sorry. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I'm moving.
There we are.
Look at the document. This is SBD 6.1. This is the official.
This is the new one.
The new one, eh?
Yeah.
So it doesn't talk about JVs to start off with. It just talks about price and specific goals.
Yeah.
It doesn't talk about B certificates, nothing.
Yeah.
It gives a guide on the document itself, which I think is quite pretentious, because it literally removes the requirement for a B certificate altogether. Yeah. If you just look, yes, how the table is to be completed, and you would see that they talk about enterprise owned by Black people.
These are the SPD is officially blank there. These are.
Yes. I just want to show you. This is now how the form sort of. Yeah. It specifies these 5 areas.
That's right.
And by the way, you're not limited to these 5 areas. And what I've seen, and I'm talking the practice now. I'm not talking theoretical here, because this is what we see in our committees. Is I want to now flip to I just have one. How do I do this again? I want to quickly go to a slide, which I must just put in presentation mode. To just show you.
There we are. We can see it.
Yeah, I just want to show you an example of an abattoir that the Department of Rural Development has procured, how they show how they allocate the points. So again, they've got the EME, QSE, they've got location, they gave some points to region location, women, youth, and disability, which then makes up the 20 points. And what was interesting is what evidence they were using to support this. They were using the CSD report, because the CSD contains these things. So where's the scorecard? Where's the and the guy who won it was a JV. So very strange and weird scenario. So the rules is on the head at this stage, and that's what's happening out there right now. Yeah. And I don't see any legislation that changes this in the near future. So for all intents and purposes, a lot of things has been undone because of this whole new PPR.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Andres. I couldn't agree more. That's why I'm always stressing the point of there is no uniformity out there. And the gap that has been raised is now it's upon you as a department to look at what is in your mandate, where are you based, how are you targeting, and who are you targeting? And therefore you can then build up and say, look, in my municipality, if I'm municipal manager in eThekwini, I will then have a responsibility to the community of eThekwini. That's my first call. So that's why I'm actually saying I will give a point to a tenderer who is actually paying rates in eThekwini. I don't know if you understand where I'm going to. So, and again, what is my second target? And if you look at that, the whole element, the triple PFA is talking about RDP goals. And you go to the NDP, the whole RDP goals are vast. So it's upon each and every entity to look at their mandate as far as where they are positioned, and also look at how then are you advancing the course in terms of transformation and what. Then you have to pick from those vast RDP goals to make sure that you can allocate at least points within those 10 or 20 points, which in any way will not advance anybody. And that is why we've always been having a problem with the triple PFA, because we are locked into those 90-10 and 80-20 points without actually having any dip into what the government or what the NDP is trying to achieve. Thanks, Sean.
And maybe just to add to that, what's almost like an atrocity, because again, as I say, I'm looking at tenders as they're being awarded, and as the previous gentleman said, we're not really achieving transformation. Because the goals are set inconsistently, meaning this department says locality is important, that department, that municipality says women is important. I just showed you one where they have youth and disabled and women involved. It dilutes the objective, and the contractor that's bidding, or the bidder, he's so confused. He doesn't know if he's supposed to, what goal they are supposed to pursue, because today it's women, tomorrow it's disabled, next day it's location. And I think we've lost the plot at this stage in a very bad way. And if you look at transformation in South Africa, this is probably the darkest days ever. So it's very strange. And like I said, the minute you do not demand a BE certificate from a SANAS approved agent, because that SANAS approved agent will apply the relevant scorecard, then you basically just trash the whole section 2172 right there.
Thanks very much on this. Tava, did you want to respond on that one, Richard?
I'm fine, Sean. I'm fine. I agree totally with Andres.
Thank you.
Yeah, no. I also do agree. This has thrown the entire procurement transformation into complete disaster. I guess through this is the only way we can try to bring in some level of consistency, to bring it as close as we can to what are the relevant requirements, at least in construction. With the hope, Richard, that will at least provide some little bit of sanity and certainty, and hoping that will sort of clarify a whole lot of things. But like I said earlier, we'll be too ambitious if we expect that these guidelines will cure all the discrepancies and the complexities that have since existed. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you very much. So
maybe if I can give one small bit of advice to the developers of any form of, let's call it, procurement guidelines or scorecard guidelines. You need to be very specific, because we now know people are using the specific goals, and they using SBD 6.1 as the implementation tool. What any form of guideline must do for a industry, now let's use the construction industry, is saying when you are procuring for this industry, this is the stipulated specific goals. By being upfront and having industry-specific goals as opposed to allow the procuring entity to set its own, at least it creates some form of guidance to the bidders that then can transform themselves to get the maximum score on those particular objectives, that specific objectives. And that's the way you'll transform. So it's super important that those that do have the ability to dictate policy in a given industry, that the industries, and you can almost say the scorecard system is going to be replaced, on the manner of speaking, by a new specific goal system that could sort of bring sanity to the current scenario. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andries. 100%.
Richard, did you get out of today some value, Tava?
From my side, Sean.
Yeah.
From my side, Sean, I'm glad that I brought Tavo in the team, and I'm glad that colleagues has given valuable inputs into the process. And as practitioners, we are the ones who experience this, and we are the ones who need to shape whatever legislation or whatever regime that is coming. And I'm glad that we have this platform to do that. And thank you, colleagues, on behalf of CIDB. Tabo?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone who participated. Jacqueline Hule and Mr. Lowe, I think your inputs and comments were extremely valuable and helpful in providing the blind spots that exist somewhere out there. And like Andries Lowe said, specificity is going to be some form of help in ensuring that, because we're operating in construction and we now already have the construction sector code, we have the procurement bill, we have all sorts of documents that give us a sense of what the priorities are here. So we're not going to be looking for a black cat in a dark room. We're not going to be roaming around without any clarity. We'll do our best to limit the document to those levels of specificity. But yeah, let's hope that it will contribute significantly in at least providing certainty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tava. I'm sure you're keeping a close eye as well as to what's happening in the Samuel case, the challenges that are taking place there at the moment, because it's smacking your industry. Very relevant to this discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Richard, and your team. Thank you, Tava. And Richard, what is the next step?
The next step is for us to go back to the drawing board to incorporate the team's inputs, and then we will then come back to the same platform to look at the final product and test it out and all that. And obviously, with the comments that we got, it actually warrants us to issue more of the practice notes. Colleagues, you might understand that we are on a 3-year cycle of the standard for uniformity, and as you know, that is the CIDB, we are taking uniformity very seriously. And Mr. Lowe, we are busy now with the amendments of the standard for uniformity, which will be issuing the next version, 2024 version of the standard for uniformity, which obviously we will then get inputs from you. And other guidelines that we'll be issuing, we will then, inform and get input from this platform. It's a very, very, very valuable platform, and we really appreciate your inputs. I was actually surprised that most of you never heeded our call when we called for the members to join our National Stakeholder Forum, because this is the kind of engagement that we would like you to have with our board, with our minister, because as practitioners, as we develop these prescripts, we need your support to show even our political heads that this is what the practitioners are experiencing, and this is what we are redressing in future. So yes, Sean, thank you so much, and yeah, colleagues, this is not the end of us. CIDB is a development board, and as we develop together. So thank you, Sean.
Everyone, thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I don't know yet what we've got arranged for next week. There's still a lot of work that's happening behind the scenes on the public procurement bill. I know that they're still taking submissions and input as we speak. And the version of the bill has gone back to Treasury, and they're addressing some of the issues. I think that the committee said that it's not necessary to send the bill back, but that's what they've actually done, is they've given it back to Treasury to do some work on before they're going to be working on it. So very interesting to see what developments take place there. And yeah, let's see. This is a dynamic industry that we're in. I just want to quickly, in closing, just mention that the next big public procurement seminar that will be taking place will be one on public procurement and innovation, public procurement for innovation, public procurement of innovation, and that will be in November. I don't have the dates with me right now, but just drop me a message and I'll re-put onto the Telegram group when that will be taking place. It is in November. And Richard, you'll be very interested to know that there is a massive focus around the world on innovation in the construction sector and how we should be, as public entities, as procuring institutions, we should be buying innovation in the construction sector. So that's one you really want to attend. There is no cost to attending. And I think it's around the 20th, I'm going to say. Get that issue probably soon. So we might even have something in that next week. But thanks everybody for joining us. And yeah, we'll get this video onto the YouTube channel quite soon. All the best. Thank you, Richard.